In the ancient world, breakfast was rarely the elaborate meal we might expect today. In most cultures, it was a simple, practical affair designed to provide sustenance for the hard work ahead. The morning meals were functional, connecting the people of these early civilizations to their natural environment and daily duties. The meals were not rushed, but were part of a slower pace of life, where the ritual of preparing food held meaning beyond just nourishment. Breakfast was not merely a meal. It was an important cultural and social moment that set the tone for the day. The ancient Egyptians, who lived along the lush banks of the Nile River, relied heavily on the fertile land surrounding them. Bread and beer formed the cornerstone of the Egyptian breakfast, a diet rich in the grains that grew along the river's banks. Bread, made from emmer wheat, was considered one of their most important staple foods. It was baked fresh every day in small clay ovens, and the process of baking bread was a daily ritual in Egyptian households. For the common people, bread was often served with a cup of beer, which was thick and porridge-like in consistency. This beer, brewed from fermented barley, was far from the strong alcohol we think of today. Instead, it was a lightly fermented drink that provided a boost of energy, and it was commonly consumed throughout the day, especially by the workers who built the great monuments of Egypt. The beer was not just a refreshing drink, but a practical one, offering sustenance for the laborers. The sugar content from the barley and the small amount of alcohol helped keep people energized during long hours of work. For wealthier Egyptians, breakfast could be a little more elaborate, with honey and fruit added to their meals. They might eat dates, figs, and pomegranates, all fruits that grew in abundance in Egypt's warm climate. Honey, considered a divine treat, was a prized addition, and it was often used to sweeten the beer or to drizzle over their bread. These extra touches, while not commonplace for the average Egyptian worker, added a sense of luxury for the elite. For ancient Egyptians, breakfast was not just about sustenance. It was a moment of connection to their gods and to the fertile land that provided their food. Their entire lives revolved around cycles: the flooding of the Nile, the growth of crops, and the rise and setting of the sun. Breakfast, as part of the larger daily ritual, was symbolic of this connection to the natural world and the divine order. For the priests and royal families, breakfast could include offerings to the gods before they started their daily tasks, emphasizing the importance of divine favor in everyday life. In ancient Greece, the first meal of the day was equally simple but served a different purpose. Greek society, while appreciating the art of dining and the social importance of meals, still valued practicality, especially for those who needed to work for a living. Breakfast for the average Greek consisted mostly of barley bread, which was often dipped in wine or olive oil. The bread itself was dense and hearty, made with barley flour, a much cheaper grain than wheat. Barley was the grain of the common people and was used in many different forms of food. Wine was a central part of Greek culture, and it was common for it to be consumed throughout the day, albeit in diluted forms. Drinking wine, especially in the morning, was not unusual for the Greeks. However, unlike the modern idea of drinking wine, the Greek version was heavily diluted with water, making it a refreshing, hydrating drink rather than an intoxicating one. Some Greeks would also add honey to their wine in the mornings, creating a sweet and energizing mixture. This morning drink was not just for the rich. Even the working class would drink wine to start the day. It wasn't just the working Greeks who consumed these meals. Wealthier Greeks enjoyed more elaborate breakfasts, which could include cheese, olives, or fruits like figs and pomegranates. Again, similar to the luxuries enjoyed in Egypt. The Greek diet was balanced, with an emphasis on grains, fruits, vegetables, and modest amounts of meat. The emphasis on barley bread, often served with a wine-based drink, highlighted the practical nature of their breakfast. The Greeks, too, saw their meals as an opportunity to connect with nature, as wine, olive oil, and grains all came from the land and were seen as gifts from the gods. In ancient Rome, the breakfast meal was known as ientaculum. Roman breakfasts were simple, primarily based on bread. The Roman Empire was known for its engineering feats and vast territorial expansion. But the daily meals of the average Roman citizen were practical and often modest. Their breakfast was typically a quick meal, consisting of bread dipped in wine or vinegar. In the early days of the Republic, vinegar was used not just as a condiment, but as a drink, mixed with water to hydrate and refresh the body. The bread was sometimes topped with cheese, olives, or fruits, but these were more luxuries than standard additions. For the Roman elite, breakfast could also include eggs, sausages, and fresh vegetables, offering a more varied start to the day. Romans were not immune to the pressures of work, and breakfast was seen as a way to prepare for the tasks of the day. For the working classes, breakfast was quick and practical. A few pieces of bread dipped in wine or vinegar could energize them before they set off to the fields, the market, or other jobs that would take up much of their day. For the wealthy, their breakfast spread might include various types of eggs, freshly harvested vegetables, and a variety of breads, showcasing the differences in class and wealth in Roman society. In addition to bread, some Roman citizens also ate porridge in the mornings, a humble dish made from oats, barley, or farro. Porridge was often flavored with honey or fruit, especially for those who could afford it. The simplest porridge would be made with water and grains alone, while the wealthier Romans might include milk or butter in their recipes, making it a more filling meal. This dish was ideal for the laborers who needed something quick and nutritious to get them through the morning hours. Mesopotamian breakfasts, while similarly simple, centered primarily around barley, a crop that was abundant in the region's fertile soil. Bread made from barley was often accompanied by fruits, particularly figs and dates, which grew well in the region. The Mesopotamians, like their Egyptian counterparts, relied on beer for sustenance, though their beer was somewhat different. Often made with barley and flavored with various grains and fruits, Mesopotamian beer was a thick, porridge-like consistency. For the working classes, it was a vital source of hydration and nutrition, and it paired well with the bread and fruits that were common in their diet. Beer in Mesopotamia was not seen as an indulgence or luxury, but a basic part of daily life. The beverage provided much-needed calories, especially for those working long hours in the fields or as laborers in the city. Just like in Egypt, beer could be consumed at any time of day, but for many, it was an integral part of their breakfast routine. Meals often started early in the morning, as people needed to begin their day's work before the heat of the sun set in. Bread and beer were a staple breakfast that could be prepared quickly and efficiently. For the ancient Chinese, breakfast was also a straightforward, practical meal. Rice congee, a porridge made from boiled rice and water, was often the first meal of the day. Kanji could be sweetened with sugar or topped with pickled vegetables for flavor. It was a simple dish, nourishing and easy to prepare, providing warmth and sustenance after a night of rest. Kanji was a versatile dish, and Variations included savory versions with vegetables or meat. For the more affluent members of society, breakfast might include steamed buns, dumplings, or rice cakes, often eaten with tea. Tea, which had been cultivated in China for centuries, was an integral part of Chinese daily life, and it was no surprise that it made its way into breakfast. Tea was both refreshing and invigorating, providing warmth in the cold mornings and a gentle energy to begin the day. It was often served with steamed buns or dumplings, which were made from rice or wheat flour. The meal might also include small portions of fish or vegetables, depending on what was available. For the more affluent, a hearty breakfast with rice, cakes and various condiments might be enjoyed in the early hours before the demands of the day began. In the Americas, breakfast traditions varied greatly, with maize corn being the most important food staple across many ancient civilizations. The Aztecs, for instance, often began their day with tortillas made from ground maize, sometimes paired with beans or chili. Tamales, made with masa, corn dough, and often filled with beans, meats, or chilies, were another common breakfast food. These meals were rich in nutrients and provided the energy needed for the long, active days of the Aztec people. The Maya civilization, too, relied heavily on maize, and their breakfast meals often consisted of maize tortillas, sometimes served with fruits or vegetables, and occasionally with a hot beverage like a twele, a drink made from ground maize mixed with water or milk. These breakfasts were straightforward and nourishing, a reflection of the importance of maize in their diet in the Andes. Quinoa was another crucial food staple, and the indigenous peoples often ate quinoa porridge for breakfast, sometimes combined with fruits or vegetables. Quinoa provided a significant source of protein, making it a vital part of the breakfast routine, especially for people in higher altitudes who needed the energy to perform laborious tasks in the cold, mountainous regions. The morning meal across ancient civilizations was not just a mere routine. It was often the first act of the day that connected people to their environment, their work, and, in many cases, their gods. As we explore more civilizations, we'll find that while the meals themselves may have been simple, they were rich in meaning and were woven into the daily fabric of life. The significance of these meals lies not just in what was consumed, but in how it was prepared, who it was shared with, and the connection to the broader community and spiritual beliefs of the time. For instance, in ancient Greece, where the emphasis was placed on balance and harmony, breakfast was a way to start the day with simple sustenance that aligned with their dietary principles. The Greeks, known for their philosophical outlook and pursuit of moderation, typically enjoyed a breakfast that was light and quick. Barley bread was a common choice, often served with a sprinkling of olive oil and a dash of salt. Sometimes the bread was dipped in wine, a common practice for the Greeks, even in the morning, as they believed it provided not only hydration, but a mental clarity that prepared them for the intellectual and physical challenges of the day. For the wealthy Greeks, their breakfast spread could include cheese, figs, and olives. These were items that could be quickly sourced from the land and prepared without much effort. The addition of fruit like figs was particularly common, and they were considered both a nutritious and luxurious treat. The figs, so abundant in the Mediterranean region, offered sweetness and a balance to the bitterness of the bread and the saltiness of the olives. For the Romans, breakfast was much like their Greek counterparts, but it was viewed as a more utilitarian meal to prepare them for the day's work. The Roman concept of iantaculum, the morning meal, was typically based on bread, often dipped in wine or vinegar, which helped start the day with hydration and refreshment. The more affluent Romans, like those living in villas or towns, might have had eggs, sausages, and even fruits or cheeses. These breakfast foods were often served in small portions to ensure that the workday started with enough energy, but not so much as to hinder productivity. In Roman society, breakfast was not a social affair, at least not in the same way that lunch or dinner could be. Breakfast was a personal time, often taken alone or with family members before the rush of the day. However, it was seen as a necessary meal for the working class, giving them the strength to begin their labor-intensive day, whether it was farming, building, or other hard physical work. It was a meal that required little preparation, often just the simple act of breaking off pieces of bread and dipping them into wine. The Mesopotamians, like the Egyptians, found themselves deeply connected to the land that nourished them. Barley was a fundamental crop, and the people of Mesopotamia consumed barley bread as their main form of sustenance. For them, breakfast was often a simple affair consisting of this bread, often paired with beer, which was essential to daily life. The beer, much like the bread, was made from barley and sometimes flavored with fruits or spices. This drink was thick and filling, offering more than just hydration. It was a meal in itself. Just like in Egypt, beer in Mesopotamia was not only consumed by adults, but children and workers would also partake, as it was a crucial part of their diet. For those in the Mesopotamian cities, a more elaborate breakfast might include fruit, such as figs or pomegranates, which grew in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The combination of barley bread, beer, and fruits provided the necessary nutrients for the day's work, and it is likely that families gathered together in the mornings to share this meal before setting out for the day's tasks. These meals were not only functional but deeply connected to their environment. What was grown in the fertile soil was reflected in the foods they ate, and the rhythm of daily life was often tied to the agricultural calendar. Similarly, the ancient Chinese, with their long history of rice cultivation, had a different take on the morning meal, which was rooted in their agrarian lifestyle. In China, rice was at the core of their diet, and breakfast often consisted of rice congee, a simple porridge made by boiling rice in water or broth. This meal was easy to prepare and highly versatile, capable of being sweetened with sugar or served with savory toppings such as pickled vegetables, herbs, or even small portions of meat. Congee was an ideal breakfast food for the rural laborers who needed a warm, nourishing meal to get them through the early morning hours. For those with greater means, congee might be accompanied by steamed buns or dumplings filled with vegetables or meat. These breakfast treats were often served alongside a cup of tea, which had begun to be cultivated and consumed in China centuries before. The warm tea would provide a comforting balance to the hearty meal, preparing the body for the work ahead, whether it be farming, crafting, or other daily tasks. In wealthier homes, tea and rice cakes became a more refined and symbolic part of the morning ritual, reflecting the role food played in both daily life and social status. Tea itself, which had been discovered in China around 2700 BCE, was often a central part of many meals, including breakfast. For the Chinese, tea symbolized life's connection to the natural world, and its consumption had a spiritual component. Drinking tea in the morning was not only for sustenance, but also a moment of reflection and meditation. Tea culture in China became so intertwined with the meal practices of the region that it evolved into one of the most important cultural elements in daily life. Further across the globe, breakfast customs in the Americas also centered on maize, a staple food that had been cultivated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. In Mesoamerica, particularly among the Aztecs and Maya, breakfast often consisted of maize-based foods like tortillas, tamales, and atole. These foods were often accompanied by beans, chilies, or a drink called atole, made from masa corn dough mixed with water or milk. The richness of the maize, combined with the protein from beans and the spice of chilies, made for a hearty and sustaining breakfast that fueled the long days of agricultural work. In addition to maize, the Maya also cultivated cacao, which was used to make a bitter beverage often consumed in the mornings. This drink, considered sacred, was typically prepared with ground cacao beans, water, and spices. The drink was revered as a gift from the gods and was thought to provide strength, clarity, and protection for the laborers and warriors. Cacao also played a prominent role in the daily life of the upper classes, where it was prepared with a mixture of honey and other sweeteners. In the highlands of the Andes, breakfast was marked by the consumption of quinoa, a grain that had been cultivated for centuries by the indigenous peoples. Quinoa, a high-protein grain, was often made into porridge or ground into flour to make bread. This was a meal that provided ample energy for those living in the high altitudes, where the cold mornings required a substantial and sustaining meal to get through the long hours of physical labor. Quinoa porridge might be eaten with local fruits or vegetables, which added natural sweetness and nutritional value to the meal. Quinoa was not only a food for sustenance, but also a symbol of the connection between the people of the Andes and their land. Its cultivation was a sacred practice, and the grain was regarded as a gift from the gods. The traditional breakfasts of the Andean peoples centered around quinoa, maize, and potatoes, were thus not only practical but also tied to their deep spiritual beliefs. Breakfast in these diverse ancient cultures was far from uniform, yet there was a common thread that linked them all together. Breakfast was not just the first meal of the day, but a reflection of the people's culture, their agricultural practices, and their spiritual beliefs. From the barley bread and beer of Mesopotamia to the quinoa porridge in the Andes, breakfast was a simple meal that served both practical and spiritual purposes. It was a way of connecting to the earth, preparing for the work ahead, and acknowledging the gifts that nature provided. Breakfast in ancient civilizations was far more than just a meal. It was an integral part of the daily cycle, often tied to spiritual beliefs, social structure, and physical labor. For many ancient people, breakfast was not just the first meal of the day, but a means to prepare both body and mind for the challenges ahead. The simplicity of the meal did not detract from its importance. Instead, it reflected the culture's values, traditions, and connection to the land and the divine. In ancient Egypt, the first meal of the day was a time to connect with the rhythms of nature, the Nile, and the gods. While the working classes may have started their day with a basic meal of bread and beer, the cultural significance of these foods cannot be overlooked. Bread in Egypt was not merely a source of sustenance, but a symbol of life itself. The Egyptians often shaped their bread into sacred symbols, such as the ankh, a symbol of life, and scarab beetles, which were believed to have protective powers. This meant that even the simplest food consumed in the morning carried divine symbolism and was connected to the belief in eternal life and the afterlife. Beer, while seen as a common beverage, was no less important. It was consumed not just as a source of hydration or energy, but as a sacred drink. Beer in Egypt was thick and hearty, providing a nutrient-rich base for the physically demanding day ahead. It was part of the shared daily routine of the Egyptians. From farmers to the royal courts, the act of consuming bread and beer together was a ritual that connected the people to the earth and the divine forces that governed their lives. For those in higher social classes, breakfast could be a little more luxurious, as it involved fruit and honey, often served alongside the bread and beer. Wealthier Egyptians had access to more exotic fruits, such as figs, pomegranates, and dates. These fruits were considered a divine gift from the gods and were often eaten as a way of acknowledging the bounty provided by the Nile. The addition of honey, which was sacred and prized, not only sweetened the meal but also added to its symbolic connection to the gods. In ancient Greece, breakfast was a reflection of the values of moderation and balance. The Greeks, known for their philosophical pursuits and love of reason, placed great importance on the concept of sophrosyne, or self-control. This idea of balance extended to their meals. Breakfast, typically a quick and simple meal, was designed to provide enough energy to fuel the mind and body without overindulgence. Barley bread, often dipped in wine or olive oil, was a practical, humble start to the day. For the Greeks, breakfast was not meant to be an elaborate meal but a sustaining one, providing the right amount of nutrition to support the intellectual and physical activities of the day. Wine, although it is often thought of as an alcoholic drink, was commonly consumed by the Greeks in the mornings, but it was usually diluted with water. This practice made the wine more hydrating and less intoxicating. The Greeks also added honey to their wine at times, as it was considered both a sweetener and a way to bring out the natural flavors of the wine. Honey itself was a symbol of purity and sweetness in Greek culture, and its presence at breakfast reflected the Greeks' reverence for nature's gifts. The addition of fruit, like figs, was a treat that brought a sense of pleasure and indulgence to the otherwise simple morning meal. In contrast, Roman breakfasts were more straightforward and practical, often designed to prepare the individual for a day of hard work or military duty. The typical Roman breakfast, known as ientaculum, consisted of bread, often dipped in wine or vinegar, and occasionally supplemented with cheese, fruit, or leftovers from the previous evening's meal. Roman society placed great importance on efficiency, so breakfast was often a simple, functional meal designed to fuel the body without taking up too much time. For the working class, who often rose early to begin their labor, a quick breakfast was a necessity. Wealthier Romans, however, had more variety and choice. Their breakfast could include eggs, sausages, and fresh vegetables, as well as bread and fruit. These foods were a reflection of their higher social status and access to a greater variety of foods. Yet even for the wealthy, breakfast was typically a private affair, eaten alone or with family before heading off to work or political engagements. Unlike the later medieval or modern tradition of communal breakfasts, the Roman morning meal was more solitary and utilitarian. The social role of breakfast in Roman society also reflected the broader cultural norms of Roman life. Meals in Rome, especially breakfast, were less about socializing and more about preparing for the day's work. This practicality extended to the way Romans viewed food, something that was necessary to sustain life, but not something to be overly focused on. Romans were pragmatic, and their simple breakfasts reflected their attitude toward food. It was there to serve a purpose, not to be a grand event. In Mesopotamia, breakfast was much the same as in Egypt, practical and rooted in the agricultural cycles of the land. The Mesopotamians, living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, relied heavily on barley as a staple crop. As in Egypt, the morning meal consisted mainly of barley bread, accompanied by a drink made from fermented barley, essentially a thick, porridge-like beer. This meal provided essential calories and hydration for those who worked long hours under the hot Mesopotamian sun. Beer, like in Egypt, was not merely a beverage. It was an important part of the diet for both adults and children. Barley, bread, and beer were integral to the daily lives of the Mesopotamians, fueling their labor-intensive tasks. Mesopotamian workers, whether they were farmers, craftsmen, or merchants, needed a breakfast that was both filling and easy to prepare. Beer, in particular, served as both a drink and a meal, rich in nutrients, and was an important part of the early morning routine. For the wealthy, breakfast might include fruit, such as figs or dates, and sometimes honey was added to the bread. The abundance of fruits in Mesopotamia, thanks to the fertile land, provided variety and sweetness to the morning meal. The luxury of these items, however, was reserved for the elites, while the common folk relied on more basic fare. In ancient China, breakfast often involved rice kanji, a simple porridge made by boiling rice with water or broth. This meal was not only a practical choice for sustaining energy throughout the day, but it also carried spiritual and cultural significance. Kanji, like many other Chinese dishes, was seen as a way of harmonizing the body with the natural elements. The warmth and consistency of congee provided comfort and nourishment, and the act of preparing and consuming it was an opportunity to connect with the earth and the elements. Tea, too, was an important part of the Chinese morning ritual. By the time the Zhou dynasty arrived, tea had become an essential part of daily life. It was consumed not just for its physical benefits, but also for its spiritual and medicinal properties. Tea represented a connection to the natural world, and its consumption was seen as a way of promoting balance and harmony within the body. For wealthier families, breakfast might include steamed buns, dumplings, or rice cakes, along with tea, which provided a moment of calm and reflection before the day's work began. The practice of drinking tea, which was deeply ingrained in Chinese culture, also reflected a larger spiritual practice of mindfulness. Tea, brewed carefully from leaves, provided a means of slow, deliberate consumption. The act of preparing tea and drinking it slowly became a moment of meditation, a way to center oneself before beginning the day's tasks. In the Americas, especially in the Aztec and Maya civilizations, breakfast meals were heavily centered around maize. The Aztecs, who were one of the first to cultivate and consume maize in large quantities, often began their mornings with tortillas made from ground maize, which were then paired with beans, chili, or a drink made from maize called atole. Atole, often sweetened with honey or flavored with chocolate, provided energy and warmth to start the day. The Aztecs, like their Maya counterparts, had a deep spiritual connection to maize, viewing it as a sacred food given to them by the gods. For the Maya, breakfast often consisted of tortillas and tamales made from maize, filled with beans, vegetables, or chilies. The Maya also consumed atole, a drink that provided the necessary sustenance for the long hours of agricultural work that awaited them. Atole, made from corn dough mixed with water or milk, was often consumed with honey, which had both nutritional and spiritual significance. In the Andean highlands, breakfast meals were similarly practical, with quinoa being the staple grain. Quinoa porridge was common, and its high protein content made it ideal for those working at high altitudes. Quinoa, like maize in Mesoamerica, was not just a food but a symbol of connection to the earth. The Andean peoples believed that the grain was a gift from the gods, and its consumption in the morning was a way to honor the earth and ensure a good harvest. Quinoa porridge, sometimes served with local fruits or vegetables, was a nourishing start to the day for the highland peoples, who lived in challenging conditions. As we continue our journey through the morning routines of ancient civilizations, it becomes increasingly evident that breakfast, while simple, played a significant role in shaping not only the physical well-being of individuals, but also their social structure, religious practices, and relationship with the environment. In ancient Egypt, breakfast was often the first opportunity of the day to connect with the gods and the earth, while the majority of the population began their day with bread and beer. The more affluent Egyptians might enjoy a meal that was a little more indulgent. In addition to honey and fruits like figs, dates, and pomegranates, the wealthy had access to dairy products. Milk, cheese, and yogurt were consumed by those who could afford them, adding richness to their morning meals. For the elite, breakfast was often a luxurious moment to reflect on the bounty of the Nile, which provided not just food, but a spiritual connection to the land in the larger context. Breakfast in ancient Egypt was seen as a time to fortify the body before embarking on the day's tasks, which often involved physical labor, whether in the fields or as part of monumental building projects like the construction of pyramids or temples. For the working class, the simplicity of bread and beer, made from grains grown along the fertile banks of the Nile, allowed them to focus on their duties. But even for the laborers, this meal with sacred bread was often shaped into symbolic forms such as the ankh, the symbol of life, or the scarab beetle, which was believed to have protective powers. In a way, the food itself carried divine protection, ensuring that workers could endure the physically demanding tasks ahead. Moving westward to ancient Greece, we see that breakfast was less about indulgence and more about balance and nourishment. The Greeks, known for their love of philosophy and reason, took a somewhat pragmatic approach to food, ensuring that breakfast provided the necessary energy without being overwhelming. They typically consumed a simple meal of barley bread, sometimes with honey or olive oil, and occasionally a small portion of cheese. For a drink, the Greeks often turned to diluted wine, a beverage that had its place in all meals, especially for the working class. What is fascinating about Greek breakfasts is how tied they were to the cultural and philosophical idea of moderation. The Greeks, unlike the Egyptians or Romans, did not view the first meal of the day as an opportunity for excess. Instead, it was seen as a way to sustain oneself in moderation, focusing on long-term health rather than immediate gratification. For the affluent, the breakfast could include fruits like figs or grapes, with honey being the sweetener of choice. However, even for the wealthy, the meal remained simple, something to provide just enough sustenance before they began their intellectual or physical pursuits. In fact, many Greek philosophers, such as Socrates, were known to eat very simple meals, often just a piece of bread with olive oil, emphasizing the idea of restraint. In Rome, the concept of ientaculum was not just a morning routine, but also a reflection of Roman practicality. Romans were known for their immense empire-building efforts, and their breakfasts were built for function, not luxury. The typical Roman breakfast consisted of bread, usually dipped in wine or vinegar, which helped to soften the crust and add flavor. The bread might also be sprinkled with salt, cheese, or herbs. The working class would often dip their bread into wine or vinegar to hydrate and prepare for a day of hard labor. The wealthy Romans, in contrast, could afford to add fresh fruit, eggs, and sausages to their first meal of the day, signaling the social stratification that existed in Roman society. Roman breakfasts, however, were typically taken in solitude or within the family unit. Unlike their later counterparts in the Middle Ages or even in modern Europe, Romans did not generally use the first meal of the day as a social occasion. The Roman emphasis on efficiency was evident in the simplicity of breakfast there was. No need for grand displays of food in the early hours of the morning. Breakfast was more about practicality, allowing individuals to start the day and get to their various tasks, be it military service, governance, or trade. For Romans, especially the laboring classes, a simple meal was sufficient to fuel the body, giving them just enough energy for the demanding work that lay ahead. In ancient Mesopotamia, breakfast meals were similarly grounded in practicality. The Mesopotamians, who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, relied heavily on barley as their staple food, just like the Egyptians. Bread made from barley was the foundation of the Mesopotamian breakfast, often accompanied by a cup of beer, just as in Egypt. The beer served as both a drink and a source of nourishment, filling the workers with calories and providing hydration for a day spent under the harsh sun. It was especially important for the laboring classes who worked in the fields or on large construction projects such as ziggurats or canals. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia was thick and porridge-like, made from fermented barley and sometimes flavored with fruits like dates or figs. The drink was consumed by all classes, from the lowest peasants to the highest kings. For the royal and noble families, breakfast might include more refined meals, bread accompanied by honey or fruit preserves. The wealthy could afford to enjoy a bit more variety, but for the majority, the meal was utilitarian. The simplicity of the morning meal allowed the Mesopotamians to focus on their labor-intensive work, with barley bread and beer providing enough fuel to tackle the tasks at hand. In ancient China, breakfast was often a quieter, more reflective moment, especially when compared to the hustle and bustle of the Greco-Roman world. The Chinese, who had a long history of rice cultivation, began their day with rice kanji, a comforting porridge made from rice and water. This simple dish was often accompanied by pickled vegetables or salted meat for flavor. For wealthier families, breakfast might include dumplings, buns, or rice cakes filled with meats or vegetables. The meal would typically be paired with hot tea, which had become an integral part of daily life in China. The tea, with its warming and invigorating properties, played an essential role in both physical and spiritual well-being. For the Chinese, tea represented a deeper connection to nature and was often consumed in the morning for its calming properties, while the working class had a straightforward breakfast of congee or bread. The elite enjoyed more elaborate morning meals. These could include steamed buns, dumplings filled with pork or vegetables, and a variety of teas, including green and oolong, all served alongside rice cakes. Tea drinking in China was not just a physical need, it was also a cultural and spiritual ritual, an opportunity to pause and reflect before embarking on the day's duties. In the Americas, particularly in the Aztec and Maya civilizations, breakfast foods were often centered around maize, which had been cultivated as the primary crop. For thousands of years, the Aztecs began their mornings with tortillas, which were made from ground maize and could be paired with beans, chili, or a simple drink called atole, made from ground maize mixed with water or milk. This simple but filling meal helped prepare the Aztecs for the long hours of physical labor and spiritual devotion that lay ahead. For the Maya, maize was also the center of their morning meal. They consumed tortillas, tamales, and atole, providing them with essential carbohydrates and energy. The Maya were also fond of cacao, which was considered sacred and was consumed in various forms throughout the day. A cacao beverage, often prepared with ground beans, chili, and sometimes honey, could be part of the Maya breakfast, offering both strength and spiritual connection. For the Maya, breakfast was a time not only to prepare physically for the day's work, but also a moment to connect with the divine. As cacao was a gift from the gods, in the Andean highlands, breakfast typically included quinoa, which was a highly nutritious and protein-rich grain. The indigenous peoples of the Andes would start their day with quinoa porridge, often accompanied by local fruits or vegetables. Quinoa's high protein content made it an ideal breakfast choice for those who lived in the cold, high-altitude regions where physical labor was strenuous and required sustenance. For the Andean peoples, quinoa represented the gifts of the earth, and the breakfast meal was often both a physical and spiritual nourishment, deeply connected to their agricultural and religious practices. As we journey further into the past, we see that breakfast was not merely a physical necessity, but an integral part of daily life that also connected people to their cultural practices, religious beliefs, and social structures. In every civilization, breakfast, though humble, provided a moment of connection to the earth, the divine, and the community. The foods they ate and the way they ate them were often influenced by their relationship with the natural world, as well as by their social roles within the larger community in ancient Egypt. The act of preparing breakfast, though simple, was embedded in a larger cosmology that connected food, work, and the divine. For the Egyptian workers, the daily ritual of eating bread and beer was not just about sustenance. These foods were sacred symbols of life, and the very act of eating them was considered a form of worship. The Egyptians believed that bread symbolized the body of the god Osiris, the god of life and death. Beer, on the other hand, was often associated with the goddess Hathor, the goddess of fertility and music, and was thought to carry her protective powers. By consuming these items in the morning, Egyptians aligned themselves with the divine forces that governed their world. Even the bread they ate in the early hours of the day was seen as more than just food. It was a direct link to the gods who had provided for them. For the laborers who constructed the grand monuments of Egypt, breakfast was their first opportunity to receive divine nourishment before embarking on their day's tasks. The thick beer they drank was not just for hydration, but provided the calories and strength needed for the physically demanding work. In this sense, the simplicity of the breakfast meal was its strength. It provided the essential sustenance required for work, while also reinforcing the connection between the individual and the divine. The wealthy, of course, had a more lavish version of this meal. For them, breakfast could include a variety of sweet fruits, honey, and dairy products, luxuries that were unavailable to the common laborer. These individuals had the time, wealth, and resources to enjoy a meal that not only nourished the body, but also served as an opportunity for spiritual reflection. For the elite, breakfast was a time to contemplate the gifts of the gods and reaffirm their connection to the cycles of nature and divine favor. Similarly, in ancient Greece, the first meal of the day was grounded in simplicity and moderation, reflecting the values of Greek society. The Greeks, who revered philosophy and the intellectual life, viewed breakfast as an essential but non-intrusive part of the day. It was a meal that supported the mind and body, but did not overwhelm them. Barley bread, often dipped in wine, was the staple breakfast for the majority. The inclusion of wine, diluted with water, was not just for hydration, but also symbolized the importance of moderation and balance. The Greeks were famous for their ideals of harmony and order, and these same principles were reflected in their breakfast rituals. The wealthy Greeks, of course, had the luxury of enjoying more variety in their morning meals. They might indulge in fresh fruit like figs, pomegranates, and grapes, which added sweetness and energy to their day. However, these fruits were not just a luxury. They were a way of connecting to the bounty of the land, a land that was carefully cultivated and tended by the labor of others. Even in their wealth, the Greeks did not forget the value of simplicity, and they often ate with restraint, understanding that overindulgence could disrupt the balance of life. In ancient Rome, breakfast was viewed less as a social or religious event and more as a practical meal to prepare individuals for the day's work. Roman society was a pragmatic one, and the morning meal was seen as essential but not something to be celebrated. The typical Roman breakfast consisted of bread, which could be dipped in wine, vinegar, or sometimes just plain water. For those in the lower classes, this simple meal was quick and efficient, providing them with the energy needed to begin their laborious tasks. The working class was not given the luxury of a leisurely breakfast. Instead, they quickly consumed whatever they had at hand and moved on to the day's work. The Roman elite, however, enjoyed a more varied breakfast. Wealthy Romans could afford to eat eggs, sausages, and a selection of fresh fruits and vegetables, but these meals were still designed with efficiency in mind. The Roman elite knew that the day ahead would involve social and political affairs, military duties, or overseeing the vast empire they controlled. Their breakfast provided sustenance, but also allowed them to remain sharp and focused for the important tasks that lay ahead. For the wealthiest Romans, breakfast was often taken in private, perhaps alone or with immediate family. Unlike modern traditions, there was no grand family gathering at the breakfast table in Roman society. The meal was functional and not meant for extended socialization. This reflects the Roman attitude toward meals in general. Eating was a necessary part of life, but it was not always about enjoyment. This attitude toward food was reinforced by their overall approach to life, which emphasized efficiency, practicality, and the pursuit of order. In Mesopotamia, as in Egypt, breakfast served a crucial function for those who labored in the fields or worked as craftsmen in the cities. The daily routine began with barley bread, often paired with a cup of beer. The Mesopotamians, like the Egyptians, were tied to the land and its cycles, and their food reflected their dependence on agriculture. Beer in Mesopotamia was not just a drink, it was an essential foodstuff, providing both nutrition and hydration for the workers who toiled under the sun. The simplicity of breakfast bread and beer was a reflection of the harsh realities of life in the Mesopotamian cities and the fertile agricultural lands they worked in. The cities of Mesopotamia, workers would often consume their breakfast quickly before heading to the fields or their workshops. Breakfast was a communal experience, often shared with family members or fellow workers. This communal aspect of breakfast was a social ritual, reinforcing the bonds between people who worked together. The simplicity of the meal reinforced the focus on collective labor. Mesopotamian society, like others, relied on the cooperation of its people to function effectively. For the elite, however, breakfast could include fruits and honey, which were considered rare treats and symbolized abundance and luxury. In China, breakfast was often a quiet and solitary affair. The Chinese were deeply connected to the land, and their breakfast meals reflected this bond. Rice kanji, a simple porridge made by boiling rice in water or broth, was a common breakfast food in ancient China. This dish was both nourishing and easy to prepare, making it an ideal choice for busy families or individuals. The kanji could be sweetened with sugar or served with pickled vegetables, and in wealthier households, it might be accompanied by steamed buns or dumplings. Tea, of course, was a common drink at breakfast, providing both warmth and refreshment to start the day. The Chinese breakfast, much like their approach to food in general, emphasized balance. Food was not just for sustenance, but for maintaining harmony within the body and mind. Tea, especially, played a role in this philosophy. It was not just a beverage, but a spiritual practice. The act of drinking tea in the morning was often seen as an opportunity to reflect, calm the mind, and center oneself for the day ahead. For those in wealthier households, breakfast might be a more elaborate affair, with additional dishes, but the focus remained on simplicity and balance in the Americas, particularly among the Aztec and Maya civilizations. Breakfast meals were centered around maize, which was the primary staple crop. The Aztecs began their mornings with tortillas made from ground maize, paired with beans, chili, or atole, a drink made from maize mixed with water or milk. This meal was both practical and nourishing, providing the necessary energy for the long hours of work ahead. Atole, often sweetened with honey, was especially common, offering a comforting and warm start to the day. For the Maya, breakfast often consisted of maize-based foods like tortillas, tamales, and atole. These foods were made from corn, a sacred crop that had been cultivated for thousands of years. Maize was not just a food, but a symbol of life, and its consumption was an act of reverence. The Maya, like the Aztecs, believed that maize was a gift from the gods, and they consumed it with respect and gratitude. The simplicity of their breakfast meals reflects the practicality of their society, but it also speaks to the deep spiritual significance they attach to their food. In the highlands of the Andes, quinoa was a central component of breakfast. Quinoa porridge, often accompanied by local fruits or vegetables, provided a nutrient-rich meal to start the day. Quinoa, a high-protein grain, was ideal for those living in the cold, high-altitude regions of the Andes, where physical labor was strenuous. The Andean peoples viewed quinoa not just as food, but as a sacred gift from the earth, a symbol of their deep connection to the land. For them, breakfast was not just about nourishment, it was an opportunity to honor the earth and its cycles. Breakfast, as we have seen in earlier parts, was often a simple, functional meal. However, beneath its simplicity, there was a profound significance that went beyond just the need to nourish the body. For many ancient civilizations, breakfast was a moment for spiritual reflection, a time to honor the gods, and a chance to connect with the natural world. Whether it was in Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, China, or the Americas, the first meal of the day was not merely a start to the day, was a ritual that reinforced the culture's values and beliefs. In ancient Egypt, the act of consuming bread and beer at breakfast was both practical and sacred. The beer, often thick and nutrient-rich, was more than just a beverage, it was a source of strength for the long hours of labor ahead. The bread, shaped into sacred forms, symbolized life and connected the people to the divine. For the Egyptians, food was not merely fuel, it was a bridge between the earthly and the divine realms. The simple act of eating was imbued with religious meaning, and breakfast, as the first meal of the day, served as a reminder of the spiritual world. Bread and beer were not just sustenance, they were part of a cycle of life, death, and rebirth. a connection to the gods who ensured the harvests and the fertility of the land. The role of food in Egyptian society also had a communal aspect. While breakfast was often a solitary meal for workers, it was also a time to bond with family members before heading out to work. For the wealthier classes, breakfast was a shared moment, and it could involve family members or guests gathering around a table to enjoy a more elaborate spread. Even in their luxury, the Egyptians did not forget the importance of simplicity. Bread, honey, and fruit were essential components of the breakfast ritual, tying the people to the earth, their ancestors, and the divine dot in ancient Greece. Breakfast was often less ceremonial than in Egypt, but it still had deep cultural significance. The Greeks, known for their philosophical traditions, saw food as an important part of achieving balance and harmony. For them, breakfast was about nourishing both the body and the mind, preparing them for the intellectual and physical challenges ahead. Bread, which formed the basis of the Greek breakfast, was often accompanied by diluted wine, honey, and olives. Wine was seen as a gift from the gods, and even in the early hours of the day, it was not uncommon for the Greeks to consume it, albeit in moderation. The act of dipping bread into wine was symbolic of moderation and control, a central tenet of Greek philosophy. For the Greeks, breakfast was also a personal, solitary experience. Unlike the later communal meals that characterized their dinner rituals, breakfast was often a quiet time for individuals to reflect, prepare for the day, and, in the case of intellectuals and philosophers, to begin their mental work. The simplicity of the meal allowed the mind to focus, making breakfast not just a time for physical sustenance, but a preparation for mental clarity and contemplation. While the Greek breakfast may have lacked the grandeur of some other cultures, it was an important ritual that aligned with their values of intellectual pursuit, balance, and self-control. In ancient Rome, breakfast, or ientaculum, was similarly simple but practical. Romans, with their emphasis on efficiency and order, saw breakfast as a quick, functional meal rather than a ceremonial or spiritual one. Bread, often dipped in wine or vinegar, was the basic staple of the Roman breakfast. For the wealthy, breakfast could include a wider array of foods, eggs, sausages, and fruit, reflecting the stratification of Roman society. Breakfast was eaten quickly, often in solitude or with family members, before the busyness of the day began. For the working classes, breakfast was essential but often rushed. It was a meal to provide energy for the long hours of labor ahead. Whether it was in the fields, the marketplace, or the construction of monumental structures, Roman workers relied on a simple but nourishing breakfast to begin their day. The ritual of quickly consuming bread and wine or vinegar was not just about sustenance. It was about fortifying the body for the demands of the day's work. It also provided a moment of connection to the rhythms of the Roman society, where every day was filled with purposeful action and order. The Roman breakfast was also significant in its role as a reflection of Roman values. Meals in Roman society, especially breakfast, were not a time for elaborate feasts or long social gatherings. Instead, they were focused on preparation and efficiency. For the elites, breakfast was a time to quickly fuel the body and prepare for a day filled with political, military, or social engagements. For the common Roman, breakfast was about getting the necessary energy to perform physical labor. In Mesopotamia, the morning meal was more communal, especially in urban settings. Mesopotamian workers would often gather together to eat their simple breakfast of barley bread and beer before heading to work. The act of sharing food was an important social ritual, reinforcing bonds between laborers and their families. Just as in Egypt, the morning meal was not only a time to nourish the body, but also a time to strengthen the social fabric. Beer, like bread, was a communal drink, consumed by people of all classes, and it helped build a sense of shared experience. Mesopotamians also believed in the sacredness of food, and the ritual of sharing a meal was a spiritual act. The practice of consuming barley bread and beer was tied to the cycles of agriculture, as both barley and wheat were seen as gifts from the gods. The food itself was viewed as a blessing, and eating it was a way to express gratitude for the fertility of the land and the abundance provided by the divine. Breakfast, then, was not just a time for physical sustenance, but also for reaffirming one's relationship with the gods and the land in ancient China. Breakfast had a quieter, more reflective quality, while food was essential for daily survival. It was also viewed as a way to maintain balance and harmony within the body. Kanji, a rice porridge, was a common breakfast, consumed by families of all social classes. For the working class, kanji was a quick, easy meal that could be prepared and eaten in the morning before beginning the day's work. For wealthier families, breakfast could include steamed buns, dumplings, or rice cakes, often served with tea. Tea, a vital part of Chinese culture, was not just consumed for its medicinal and energizing properties, but also as part of a spiritual practice. Drinking tea was an act of mindfulness, a moment of quiet before the busyness of the day. The Chinese saw food as a way to connect with the natural world and maintain balance in life. Breakfast, with its nourishing properties, was believed to help restore the body and spirit. The act of eating was often a ritual in itself, especially for the elite, who enjoyed a more refined breakfast with multiple courses. For them, breakfast was not only about physical nourishment, but also a time for socialization and reflection. The sharing of food was seen as a way to strengthen familial and social bonds in the Americas. Particularly in the Aztec and Maya civilizations, breakfast was deeply connected to the land and the spiritual world. Both the Aztecs and the Maya cultivated maize, which was a sacred food and considered a gift from the gods. The act of eating maize-based foods like tortillas and tamales in the morning was more than just about sustenance. It was an acknowledgement of the divine gift of maize and a way to honor the gods. Breakfast, then, was a spiritual act, one that reinforced the sacred relationship between the people and the land. The Aztecs, who had a rich religious tradition, often began their day with a simple but hearty meal of tortillas filled with beans, or chili, accompanied by atole, a warm drink made from maize. The Maya, similarly, consumed maize-based foods like tortillas, tamales, and atole, with cacao sometimes included in their morning ritual. The preparation and consumption of these foods were spiritual acts, seen as a way to connect with the gods and honor the earth. For both the Aztecs and Maya, food was not just a means of survival, it was a way of maintaining balance with the world around them and with the divine forces that governed their lives. In the Andean highlands, quinoa was the staple food for breakfast, a food that provided sustenance and energy for the physically demanding work of the high-altitude farmers. Quinoa, like maize in Mesoamerica, was viewed as a sacred food, and its consumption was part of a larger spiritual practice. The Andean peoples, like their neighbors to the north, saw food as a gift from the earth, and the act of eating it was a way to honor the earth and its cycles. Breakfast, then, was not just a meal. It was an act of gratitude, a moment to connect with the land and the gods.